Hello everyone, question and answer video today. Yesterday I was asked, and I don't reveal by whom because it may not be interesting to publicize that, the following question. What were the principal social causes of the, in brackets, and I appreciate this very much, infantry revolution? Right, we're talking about the Middle Ages. This was a comment under my video on Western Frankish crossbowmen from the 10th to the 11th century. And he asks, was it urbanization? Does this apply to the Swiss? Or or do mountains somehow take place of cities in their growing cohesion shown versus Charles the Bald, etc.? So, this question is dear to me for a number of reasons. I have explained here and there what's the deal with medieval infantry multiple times, because if anything, I have been working on this for some time now, and it's exactly one of the questions that I posed myself back in the day when I began researching about this stuff. I wrote a little thing about it recently, and especially about first half of 14th century warfare. So today we'll answer to this question, quite broadly, because here there are a couple of things I would like to point out, and just for framing the matter proper, from specific terms of being used in the question. I appreciate very much, by the way, this question comes from a reenactor, as far as I understand. So that is also very flattering, considering that here and there I also address matters of reenactment, even though I'm not right, and I am kind of from the other side, from the enemy. No, not really. You know that I appreciate any kind of historical reconstruction for the intrinsic value it has, and for very often the very high standards it has. It's just I care very much about contextualizing everything very properly, so that the work is easier for everybody at that point, whether we are historians, archaeologists, HEMA practitioners, whatever, or multiple people at the same time. As I know, I'm just, I'm very modest historian, so I don't know what it means to fight in an armor or fencing, whatever, but I'm actually very, very fascinated. So, first of all, let's address certain aspects of the question. So, the social causes here, I'm asked. So the point here is that, of course, there were multiple causes, generally speaking, that here I presume the question includes, in the sense that we speak of urbanization, and also we look at the Swiss. Here we're looking not just at social matters, but Clausewitzianly speaking, as always, it's political, social, also the same military matters, meaning that these communities didn't just fight in a certain way because they came out like that as a standard pact. There was properly some, active decision to fight in a certain way. It is true that this stemmed naturally from mostly social possibilities, meaning that if we look, I don't know, the Flemish at Courtrai, or the same Swiss that are mentioned here, abide by the 15th century, and the 14th century was something different that, however, started emerging from there in the same region. Of course, they fought on foot, mostly because that's almost all they had, basically. And that's an important point, because we'll see that also socially wise, I mean, look at the Flemish or the Italians, we're talking about the richest areas in Europe, whereas when we look at Scotland, the German Dithmarschen, Frisia, they are literally the most depressed in Europe, among the most depressed. So there is definitely something that can't be just social about that, right? So what are the principal causes of the infantry revolution in general? And the term revolution here altogether here is put in bracket together with infantry, but properly appreciate the fact that revolution here is mostly perceived as not quite the spot on definition, because it's a term that is being widely used. Its etymology, etymologically speaking, it simply means something that changes its course, in a sense, that inverts its its trend in a way. And in part, it's not wrong, but in this case, because by the beginning of the 14th century, which is also something that predates actually, an infantry growth, so it's never like an absolute change in warfare broadly meant. We have, yes, infantry in certain areas taking over cavalry for a while. It wasn't continuous, right? By the mid 14th century was actually a break with that, and there are very few exceptions, namely the English, and maybe other areas that were however sheltered a little bit, just like Switzerland, in a way. Whereas there were other areas, such as the same Flanders, that had pioneered these and achieved mostly with Courtrai the greatest result in this infantry development, that for the following 200 years basically collected nothing but defeats at the hand of the same feudal culture that they had defeated, initially speaking, right? It's just basically Courtrai, and as a brilliant, the greatest victory, indeed, symbologically speaking, was the most important. Also politically speaking, arguably was the most important. Then there is Montpevel, that is a so-so victory, let's say. Then eventually it's just down, it's badly downhill in terms of results. But also, and this is important to realize, in spite of these failures, the Flemish kept using their system and kind of implementing it. And the first actual victory they would get was Guinegate, right, at the end of the 15th century, and also for reasons that at that point were tied to the introduction of Swiss training, albeit it failed in the lowlands at the end of the day. The Habsburgs tried that. Maximilian of Habsburg was responsible because they also had partly, gotten some of that properly Swiss military, advisors in that occasion to reform the Flemish militias, but it failed at that point still. And so the term revolution, therefore, is, we should get the timeline proper, and we will address that specifically later. But just to make it very, very simple, since the beginning, basically we have an infantry growth that goes throughout all the 11th, 12th century, probably even before, but the problem here is that we can't track it precisely. And we get, this process is often overshadowed by the development of cavalry that, let's say, between the 12th and the 13th century, not even 200 years actually, was the dominating force on the battlefields, and the decisive one, right, proper. Meaning that, of course, without infantry they wouldn't go anywhere as armies in general, but infantry alone is not able to win on Western European battlefields, and also elsewhere, for that matter, because the West had the strongest infantries in many ways. For 200, 150 years, depending from also where we're talking about. Here we're talking about mostly Francicized Europe, right, where Western feudalism had spread the most, and therefore the elites had concentrated this enormous amount of wealth in the hands of very few people that fought on horseback, and therefore could dedicate this astonishing amount of time and resources in training for war, basically for a lifetime, and especially collective training, which is what made the actual difference, right? It wasn't the single warrior that made the difference. Like always in the history of warfare, it's the unit, right? And this is extremely important to understand even further developments, for the simple reason that sometimes simple things as literally numerical proportions are often neglected, right? Sometimes we look at weapons and and tactics, but we conceive them as a sort of standard pack, or at least some laboratory object of inquiry, where we lack the understanding that, I don't know, to make the longbow effective, it took thousands and thousands of longbowmen, right, on a field in a combined tactic where you see, for example, other kind of troops, also missile ones like a crossbowman, that didn't quite perform badly because they, there was this dramatic technological difference basically crossbows and longbows achieve in if you balance out all the various factors, prestationally speaking, more or less the same results, right? There is a difficulty in acknowledging this sometimes, because we tend to look at the broader outcome of battle and we fixate on the fact that, one weapon or the other was used from both sides, but like that's not what makes the battle as such, nor we actually have an actual positive understanding of what actually happened there, right? Sources are very foggy and they don't give scientific quantities, proportions, and therefore sometimes we're just left with a reconstructional possibility that, however, cannot obviously replicate what actual tactics and minds and moral forces that is what actually makes the difference in war, in more than else in relative terms, and we're just speculating about things that we could simply draw just statistically. However, if we broaden the look at different battles and simply realize that such technical elements didn't quite make the thing, right? I would say that, of course, this is enormously debatable, and there is always room for further improvement, in meaning that, I don't know, banally speaking, if we speak of range or frequency of fire, you can objectively come to some conclusions that are also quite important, but the problem is that we just don't know how it was really there, right? And the things we used to reconstruct today are so minimal to the overall picture that was warfare, and that is still warfare, that they have a limited positive value. So there wasn't properly a revolution in this sense that we understand. It was rather this growth that by the early 14th century brought to 20 victories basically in 40 years, 50 years, and were in various areas of Europe, namely Flanders, Scotland, the German Dithmarsch and Frisian in part, Switzerland, and eventually the English army proper. That is not an area, but fundamentally the English Royal Army, which is a completely different thing also from these other areas, because it was properly a doctrinal choice, and we have explained this in other videos, but today we will try to not to digress excessively on it. Achieved victory as infantry alone, right? Which means that what existed up to that point from centuries was overthrown. It is the preeminence of the feudal elite on the battlefield that basically was the one without which you couldn't really win, right? It would always fight there, as because the entire politics and society was dominated by it, was soundly defeated. The Battle of Courtrai, with hundreds of golden spurs stripped by the corpses of French noblemen that had charged into the Flemish infantry, where the golden spurs were the prize of tournaments, right? So it was the highest military recognition, in a way, where that were offered to the Church of the Virgin of Courtrai, are the best example of this failure. But it didn't stop there. I made a video on the Battle of Courtrai in which we observed how actually tough and effective French cavalry was in that very disadvantaged situation. In many ways, how they went very close to actually winning, and how there is no certainty of victory in war. War is not a determined reality. It's always changing, and if the Flemish had not prepared a reserve that also contained one, also because they feared an attack from the French besieged garrison at Courtrai that would intervene, while the French literally broke through the Flemish phalanx, so they were able to do it. The French would have won. It would have been a massacre. So that is also an example of how it's not really a mechanical system that wins over another, but a set of different factors that are difficult to even individually, measure, and that even doesn't make sense to quite extrapolate as themselves out of the context, right? So by the mid 14th century, Black Death strikes, and the middle classes of Europe received a very deep blow, both from a demographic and economical point of view, for which there is literally what is being called a refeudalization of European warfare. This is often neglected, right? Usually, the idea is that there is a linear progress of infantry. That in part is true if you look at certain aspects of it, but in a broader political and social sense, and therefore reflected from a military point of view, this is absolutely not true. There was literally a setback of infantry that didn't quite regain steam, and especially not as a spontaneous force of commoners like it had been, importantly, at the beginning of the 14th century, with the only exception of England, but we will see it in a while, because these were all either bourgeois or peasants. Right, they were not professionals of war. The Flemish at Courtrai gained victory without having picked up a weapon in their entire life, right? And that tells you how much also things like weapons themselves are basically nothing when you actually want to kill somebody in front of you. And Courtrai is probably one of the best examples of that. And yes, that battle, even if you analyze it technically, wasn't won because the Flemish had the magic weapons, right? The Gödendagger, the Gepinderstaff, is actually useful only when you actually already stop a cavalry charge with pikes that were standardly in the front, right? These traumatic weapons that you can find also with the Swiss halberd that also cut, by the way, and that was pretty nasty. We know also was used, but mostly those were ambushes. So maybe that's a reason why it worked like that differently. Or the Scottish a double-handed axe or other weapons like that. There were lots of different weapons. Were used pretty much everywhere in Europe. Right, and even in there, it makes you understand that, once again, this weapons were surely used, with purpose, with consideration, but still they weren't what made the thing, and only when cavalry was mostly stopped, and therefore at its most vulnerable moment, that is the one exactly after the charge or caught by surprise. So cavalry, by definition, as an arm, cannot defend. Right, unless you dismount, and that becomes infantry. So that's really not about blunt, those traumatic weapons. Mostly about pikes, because without pikes you don't stop a cavalry charge, fundamentally, and you can bog it down, disorder it consistently with missile weapons. But as we will see, in certain areas, that was also a thing, and cavalry would remain central in spite of all, right? Even in spite even of the same volume of fire. I'm sorry I'm digressing so much, but you know that I got very thoroughly into this, and I'm actually speaking very generally. I could digress on every single one of these considerations, especially considering that I presume we have dramatically underestimated the proper value of missile weapons, in a sense, in their collective use and their coordination with cavalry, right? Especially in certain regions of Europe that actually seem to be very neglected, because where there was the greatest missile technology development, you see that still cavalry actually had the upper hand, which is quite fascinating in itself. And England is an exception simply because the English had been, let's say, been kind of traumatized with what happened to them against the Scots during the Wars of Independence, and therefore they began to dismount regularly to fight, but were still men at arms, and a very important quantity of them were on average mounted and would fight on horseback in most circumstances. The pitched battle would be something that we also have to evaluate in terms of strategic ratios. That is to say, if you pick Crécy or Azincourt, you see there certain numerical disproportions that make you understand why these guys would dismount rather than attacking a number of cavalry that would be so overwhelming to them, and therefore that explains part of the reason why they would entrench themselves rather than betting things on a cavalry charge, because they knew that they would be at a disadvantage after all. But it's also very complex to talk about this in outlook, as every battle is different, of course, but it should be properly investigated in terms of like how many lines of battle were there and how were these lines composed. Because even the fact that it would be just one line and multiple lines changes an enormous deal, for example, in terms of whether I want to use cavalry or not in some of these, or how much I concentrate on this bulkier chunk of infantry, or how much I can concretely do against an overwhelmingly superior enemy from a numerical point of view. So these are all things that mostly have to do with the English system against the French, and we have brutally underestimated even their French capabilities, right? So my advice is always never think that in all this cavalry didn't know what they were doing. It's really not true that knights didn't know the potential of infantry, because if there was anyone who in medieval Europe knew what the potential of any arm on the battlefield was, this was the professional elite. It was the nobility who for centuries had always standardly employed infantry, right, and was tasked with also with, properly, bringing it to the field and ordering it and deploying it. In fact, we should also point out that very often this is very clear, for example, in the Flemish armies, that those who were commanding the commoners were actually noblemen, right? The Dampierre, the Comital dynasty of Flanders, was basically pure feudal military culture. They had fought everywhere in France and Italy for generations, always on horseback. So these guys go back to Flanders at some point. They rise the rebellion, and they start fighting with infantry because it's a bit all they had there locally, but also and surely infantry had grown in importance or reduced the same importance of the feudal element, but these guys achieved certain tactical masterpieces like Courtrai, for example, and they were knights themselves. So the same goes for, as we were saying, the same French that charging through this infantry line. I mean, it was pretty evident at the time what infantry was capable of, even before a victory like Courtrai, right? There is no doubt there was a huge surprise that it was generally not believed that commoners could achieve such results, right? But we shouldn't think that the let's say the military awareness of the time, the awareness of the military potential of the time was, had no clue about what infantry could do, right? And we should see these achievements mostly like the maturity of a process that had gone on for centuries, was already known, right? As I was saying before, when we talk about the development of infantry, we mostly see that the development of cavalry had gone in parallel. Like the 13th century, we'll talk about it in a while, had been the apex of mounted warfare, of feudal warfare, and infantry had undergone the same development at the same time, right? So at some point, infantry surpassed in certain areas of Europe not much the cavalry tactical development, but the political and social possibility of employing the military instrument successfully against it on the field, which is a very different thing from saying, okay, infantry kind of evolved always in a same pattern, or was a continuous trend in this. This is mostly evidenced by the crisis of the mid-14th century for most European infantries. The only one that went on was England. Why? Because the English had fundamentally created this from the top, right? As we were saying before, Swiss, Flemish, Scots, etc., had all kind of grown, socially, economically, at a point that their political elites managed to address this strength successfully against their opponents, right? And even in there, you must have a specific political context. It's also geographically, there were factors in there, that I'm pretty much against the very concept of geopolitics, but here we mean geography in the sense of banally, we realized that all these places were kind of decentralized in a way or another, right? They weren't the center of, let's say, of great powers that that had infantries emerging from the within. Flanders were decentralized compared to Flanders. The Holy Roman Empire was all fragmented. Scotland also lived a situation that mostly has to do there with the same capabilities of England to expand in the north, but also having its own troubles, as we know, in intervention in the continent, etc. So it's very complex to actually even make a proper history in compared history of the development of these countries and spotting something. Let's say that can properly, that they can have completely in common, right? They are all different in a way or another. But not only that is Western Europe wide, and as we have seen, only very specific areas of Europe, right? These victories are not present in France, they're not present in Italy, they're not present in Spain, they're not present in other areas, they're not present, not even in Germany proper, right? If not at the outskirts of it. And there is another example, which is the Italian one, that is the overlooked one as well. The Italians, by the 12th and the 13th century, had the best infantries in Europe, right? The Italian communes had developed as essentially de facto independent city-states and properly founded on the military organization of their own political community, and as such, they had basically managed to repel the attempts of the Germanic emperors to conquer Italy and to centralize power in there. It was a bitter struggle. It lasted for generations, and in this case, we have, however, no proper infantry victory. Doesn't matter that the Italians at that point had the greatest level of development of infantry in Europe. Right, still didn't make it because that was the apex of knightly warfare, as we've seen. And in fact, the victories that are mostly remembered there are all, showing a very important resilience of infantry, but they're all basically collected by the same Italian cavalry that was always next. And this is quite crucial to understand for a reason, because wherever we look at this picture, we have to understand that there was properly no normal reason for which in Western Europe an army had to be composed only of infantry, right? All armies were by default composed by the main arms, cavalry, infantry, and say we can add missile if we want to make a bit of a distinction, stressing the importance of combined arms proper. The Italians, though, do not collect infantry victories during the 14th century. They don't have properly infantry victories on their own. There are certain things here and there. There are small events that, compared numerically to other things that were happening in Europe, weren't even just, secondary, but that properly didn't turn into a military system that would be repeatedly using only infantry armies. For the simple reason that if you had cavalry in your society, because the knightly class existed pretty much everywhere, it was pretty foolish not to use it, right? That's why we have to observe mostly not just the social background, but also the political one, because this also, historiographically speaking, has generated certain misconceptions that stress the modernistic and technologistic and progressivistic view of an infantry that, for some technical reason, emerges, right? The the Italians at some point managed to get rid of this Germanic interference, and what they do by default is that they keep having armies as they always had with cavalry and infantry. Now, what happens is that they would normally fight like that also in the early 14th century, where they were, still, massively prosperous in terms of actual even military capacities. Basically, this is Contamine already said this, but this is pretty evident. Italy was probably the most warlike, in terms of actual military activity and sheer amount of men and material involved, was the most military active country in Europe. You're talking about the center and the north. The south didn't hit either, but let's say that if you actually look at that history, which is usually not done because it's not a kingdom, it's not, at least from a unitary point of view, nobody quite cared, right? Everybody knows that there are these massive battles in Italian warfare, but they don't look at that because they say, okay, well, but, after all, we're just fighting against each other, usual quarrels among cities. Well, in these quarrels among cities, you find armies that regularly, the major pitched battles, and they were repeated for multiple times, more than other areas in Europe. Even in places like France or England had armies of 30,000 men. That is to say, the amount of infantry that you could find at Courtrai in an infantry-only army in Flanders was regularly what the Italians used in just one of the three battle lines that they usually fought like. With infantry on the flanks and cavalry in the center, that is, at this point, these city-states were booming. Right. By the end of the 13th century, at the beginning of the 14th, before the Black Death, already in Europe there was a bit of a recession, economical problems, but still the resources invested here were enormous, right? They were being spent out, so that even the mid-14th century crisis is not properly, it's not necessarily a cause, but also a consequence of this exhaustion, right? It can't be read like that. Well, what you see there is regularly professionally drilled infantries that are used in the numbers of tens of thousands of pikemen that regularly advance at the flank of cavalry and that are employed like that in a combined armed tactic. That is something that is dramatically more sophisticated than a Flemish army of the time. That is non-professional. It's usually smaller, right, and manages to score this dramatic victory at Courtrai, but not achieving much later on, against an army that also was of compared size. The fact that, as we were saying before, that a country would fight mostly with infantry was not normal, right? Why did it happen, for example, even in these areas that we're talking about? Well, the Flemish had, let's say, worn out a bit their feudal elite. They had kind of decentralized. They had this dramatically wealthy trade centers that were growing now and having their own political organization with their militias as well. So the reason why they actually wouldn't have much cavalry is that differently, for example, from Italian city-states, that were properly states, right? Differently from the Flemish ones, they didn't have such structured and stratified community to have actually consistent number of knights regularly within their cities, right? The Italians had all the time, so that's why they would keep using cavalry, while the Flemish had so few that at the end of the day, even a comital dynasty like the one of the Dampierre, that were truly noblemen, would still use in Flanders, in their home, mostly infantry, whereas they would fight elsewhere together with the Angevins, together with the French, etc., mostly cavalry on the road. So these guys were schooled to the war of all over Europe, right? Because they mostly fought with the French, in places like southern Italy, like France, like northern Italy, and so on. And they were obviously exposed to that military culture. I mean, Flanders being in between the French-German area, right, and so on. If we look at the Swiss, we can basically say the same thing. The Swiss communities developed dramatically because they enriched themselves with privileges granted by Frederick II, relatively to the trade, to the control of the passes of Saint Gotthard. That is very important because how did the Swiss emerge in the first place, right? If the German monarchy had not basically collapsed and fragmented in the second half of the 13th century, we would have not properly even had necessarily the Swiss, right? It's not the mountains in this regard that helped for sure, but it's simply a fragmented situation where you don't have a strong central power, and therefore these communities here start rising in ways that weren't even that new, right? The Swiss naturally built their national mythology around the fact that it was a sort of communion, etc. But the three Swiss cantons basically joined into a normal Landfried. That it was a measure that in Germany was usually issued by the monarchic power to pacificate certain areas that and that would work as a guard for, to prevent interference, turmoils, and so on. That's what they start doing by achieving power, and they manage to do it because also the Habsburgs that come to attack them and trying to tame them, for a reason or another, were not a dramatic power, let's say. Also, they basically made military mistakes and or were caught in situations that were simply in war, somebody has to win and somebody has to lose in a way. So they lost in battles that owed much, for example, not much to, if we're talking about the 14th century, which is dramatically different from the 15th, right? Always remember this, what the Swiss did in the 14th century and the 15th century are two very different things in the history of the military art. Right, there should be a watershed proper, which naturally doesn't exist because there was a graduality, but they're two radically different things. That is what the Swiss come up with the mid-15th century for reasons that in the 14th didn't probably even imagine, is something completely different from anything that happened in the first half of the 14th century. Right, and Swiss victories are renowningly we're talking about Morgarten, Laupen, Sempach, etc., mostly owing to this simple disadvantage they put the enemy at, sometimes, such as, ambushing them while they were not yet deployed, right, or taking position up a hill and resisting to cavalry charges. So their infantries were surely, warlike, motivated, and resistant in that sense. They had all the interest to do that, but normally they're considered not to have been better, the Scottish or Flemish infantry at the time. They didn't have, even in here, magic tactics, magic weapons. They were essentially fighting simply because they were determined to stand their ground for what they had achieved, they were building on their own. The same can be said for the Frisians that inhabited areas that also the Swiss weren't dramatically socially stratified, right? It didn't have much of knights there because there were let's say, not particularly poor areas. Now they were becoming richer, but they were before. We're talking about pastoral areas, so not like, the city-states of the Flemish or the Italians. The same goes for the Frisians and the German Dithmarschen that were instead really poor, right? But and for this very reason, they had a very few knights because simply locally, resources were so few that the commoners were simply, more numerous. The knightly elite was virtually, not insignificant, but not decisive to gain the upper hand on terrains that were terrible for cavalry. By the way, the Dithmarschen is basically just some islets of communities in the midst, literally, of marshes. In fact, Frisia also was a nightmare. And also, however, they were small communities. That is, when we're talking about this infantry victories, we also have to count, as we were saying at the very beginning, literally the numbers, right? At the Battle of Courtrai was considered a large one. The Flemish were not more than 15,000, which is not that much, right? For them, it was a lot, right? But overall, in the military history of Europe at this time, as we were saying before, there were way larger armies in other areas that also, just for that reason, from a political military point of view, that they achieved more historically, right? What was the actual potential of the Dithmarschen or Frisia, right? Scotland is a bit more interesting because Scotland was namely a kingdom. It was just, kind of theoretically even a feudal kingdom, but much less feudal than others in Europe, because even in here, the country was poor, and therefore the knightly class hadn't quite developed as much as in the neighboring England, for example, so that for this reason this class had been mostly a disadvantage. But they had kind of wilder commoners that were most up to the idea of picking up arms, and especially being numerous enough, considering the whole Scotland from a demographic point of view, and to resist annexation from the English. So that's what they do, and therefore kings like, I don't know, Robert the Bruce, etc., during the independence had cavalry, but this cavalry was contained in numbers, and therefore they relied mostly on infantry, right? But even Robert Bruce, used that because there was basically no other way to fight otherwise, but also didn't quite rely afterwards on infantry, right? Also because in all this we have to stress that it doesn't matter how the commoners were powerful in this point, but there wasn't properly any literal yes, there were kind of revolutions in the sense, I don't know, the Flemish, yes, basically still after this period managed not to be ruled by other knights. But if we look at Scotland, that was still kind of a feudal kingdom. If we look even at, some areas remained fundamentally isolated. Think about the Ditmarscher that still scored victories throughout, even up to 1500. But because fundamentally they were isolated. So that is also the measure of, yes, this is important for infantry, and this is important especially from a moral point of view, because the news traveled about these commoners that had withstood in open field heavy cavalry that is, takes massive, gigantic guts, right? So this surely boosted dramatically the morale of these classes. We don't know much about that historically, because from the sources we're not told how much confidence these guys gave to one another. We know from the Scots, I presume. Actually, I remember Robert Bruce saying that he knew of Courtrai and probably learned something like that. I mean, Flanders and Scotland are not that far, but I don't know. Verbruggen says, for example, that the struggles of the Lombards, somewhat impressed the neighboring Swiss that took courage from that. News traveled, right? So people were aware of the fact that somebody had taken up arms against knights, and that, when such victories were scored, literally, there was a collective exultation. The Flemish got, completely nuts when they achieved victory. They were so hyped, and legitimately so. And you have to think here about a history literally of oppression and exploitation. We don't have to be that romantic about the struggles. These were social classes. It's not a classist, there can't be a classist read of history as well, but objectively, this was a dramatically violent world in which the nobility literally believed that the peasantry were subhuman beings, and you are basically restrained, subjugated, relegated into a condition of moral and material inferiority for centuries, and even in terms of mindset, which is the most important thing in war. You are discouraged, but these are things that mark you, right? That make you feel less of a person at some point, and regaining confidence, because you knew the hard way that it was very difficult to actually manage to defeat cavalry. Who could do that, right? And just knowing that somebody had managed to do it surely was a thing. The Flemish had, throughout the 13th century, certain experiments, mostly ambushes, little massacres, things like that, not properly pitched battles. So, that gave them some practice alongside the thing. There were the stories of the Lombards. There were things going on for which surely this didn't happen all of a sudden, right? But surely by the 14th century, the early 14th century, for some reason in these areas, there is this concentration, literally of 20 battles, one every 2 years, that confirmed the fact that infantrymen, commoners especially, could win against heavy cavalry on the field, which is something that I can't stress enough how, morally costly it is. Right, facing a cavalry charge is one of the most radically mentally traumatizing experiences in the whole history of mankind. And I'm not exaggerating. It's something that we know from literally also more recent experiences, whereas you have modernly trained soldiers that literally cannot withstand even just the approach of cavalry, even just in movies, like it's being done without, losing cohesion, right? So never underestimate what actually meant to stand your ground in front of heavy cavalry. And in order to do that, once again, pikes had always existed. Traumatic weapons had always existed. So that's not what made the difference. What made the difference is that for the first time, there was somebody who was willing to stand their ground against the cavalry for reasons that we can't even understand. The rage, the frustration, the hope, the desire, the desperation, right? But still giving enough determination to stand that ground. There wasn't much tactical refinement. I mean, if you look at how the Flemish fought in this, there wasn't that great deal of Scottish infantry achieved some bit more of, maneuverability. As we know, the Italians, as we were saying before, were actually pretty advanced in that regard. But the concept here is that something that we should study mostly because it happened and for the moral echo that it had all over Europe, right? The Battle of Courtrai was studied by everybody. Was observed by chroniclers. I mean, it was a big event, right? There is properly a European scale of awareness of these things, especially, in the West, where news traveled fast because European politics was all intertwined. Right, these people, as we've seen, the elites fought pretty much everywhere. So they had now starting to have proper, states that were literally covering and influencing wide areas. So such events like the flower French cavalry exterminated by a bunch of stinky commoners without any military experience, considered as the Italian Chronicle says, butter bunnies that were considered the most inept, basically, of European people that had managed, to achieve this feat, is something clamorous in a way that we cannot even understand. It's as if the world had gone upside down, right? And something that really struck deeply at the same confidence of heavy cavalry. This is probably what we have to look at, because you see, heavy cavalry eventually didn't quite had to change much of its formula. Right, cavalry continued to be employed regularly in Europe. There wasn't properly a moment in which, said, no, we don't have to use cavalry anymore. It's just by the mid-15th century that states begin to say, okay, we need some professional bodies of pikemen, just as the Swiss have just invented now, and to comfort cavalry action, artillery using combined arms, etc. But nobody thought that cavalry was done for. Right, this is a myth, and it properly didn't cease. And this is mostly modernistic myth, right? It's the idea that we identify as moderns in the rise of commoners, the rise of the middle classes, of freedom, of modernity. But it wasn't like that. There is no teleology in what happened in the Middle Ages regarding to this fact. So going back to the question. The question went, what are the principal social causes, and is it urbanization? Well, urbanization played a very important part in this, meaning that it's mostly a symptom of this phenomenon. The most developed urban centers in Europe were the Italian ones. And surprise, surprise, they're the ones that produce the best infantry before the others. So yes, in that case, surely there is a coincidence, but by the term infantry revolution here, as it's called, as we've said, banally, these cities also produced knights, cavalry, right? There was never a moment in which in Italy, like in Flanders, armies were made just of infantry on a regular base. This never happened. So what do we call actually as infantry revolution here? Like something we were talking actually about that's why the term is also and rightfully put in bracket in the same question, because it's mostly like a gradual growth, right? And in countries that even when they had kind of the best infantry, they didn't quite and kept having it, didn't quite think to make it the primary arm, right? There was a political interest naturally, because it's a political matter. If even if the ruling classes of the Italian communes were made up mostly of commoners that learned, so coming mostly from, merchant activities and all this stuff, they soon became oligarchic in nature. They soon began to imitate nightly lifestyle, which had been, by the way, the normality throughout the consul regimes that were, embodied by literally military families that were knights, like any other that existed in Europe. So there was never a watershed in that. So how revolutionary in that sense is, for example, the development of infantry, thousands of infantry, regularly employed on the flanks of cavalry in Italian armies of normally size of tens of thousands of men. 40 years before that, this tactic was introduced in England, right? And was regularized during the 100 Years' War as the most, famous that we know, right? That has not been pointed out because, once again, this tactic still made a central use of cavalry, and the Italian armies fighting against each other were basically fighting always in the same way. No foreigners ever reinvaded the country, so that they were, again, fighting, for independence like the Flemish or the Scots. So nobody actually cared about the fact that here there were half of a century before, a tactic that basically is not known before. Medieval countries, and here finds, a regular employment by literally even single city-states on a regular base, with numbers that are literally the size of other European kingdoms. Why does nobody care? Because they fixated on the fact as a criterion that let's just see where, doesn't matter where or how, but by which numbers or importance, infantry defeated cavalry, right? So you see, Courtrai becomes the great big deal thing because the French army was defeated. But did that military system eventually evolve into something else that made school in European warfare? No. On the contrary, the Flemish literally lost every single battle from Mont-Lampével on up to Guinegate for basically almost 200 years. And they didn't even change the system, right? Whereas the most important military development at that point in the late Middle Ages comes from the Swiss, that in the mid-15th century decide that they want to invest so much money to finally provide every infantryman with a pike, and therefore needing dramatic more resources to provide collective training to blocks of thousands of pikemen that had to move, drill, and to become offensive for the first time, right? Because they have a specific political cohesion and vision to act on their interests. That's very important, right? Why this, for example, didn't happen in the aforementioned, in England? Because the English were not interested in creating a military class that could contest the primacy of the aristocracy. Why didn't this happen in Italy? Well, I don't know. Look at an Italian regional state, and look at, even demographically speaking, Switzerland had millions under its control at that point. An Italian regional state had sometimes important numbers, but most of these people of its inhabitants were involved in trade activity. They didn't have any interest to create a military class of professional soldiers. When these places were so rich, they could simply hire whichever mercenary they wanted and keeping it, in the right amount to keep it under control for the local rulers not to feel social, a revolution, let's say. So the answer is always political from a proper point of view. But if you look at the Swiss in the mid-15th century, they invent something that had never existed before, because for the first time they had enough resources, enough central power, let's say, to provide that training, right, for pikemen to finally become offensive. Because before, pikemen were there. The Flemish, the Scots, the Germans, the Swiss, the Italians, all used pikes. All of them. right? Sometimes even in massive numbers. The Italian example there, and I come back on it because it's really important, that they regularly employed the Tuscan Taglia, as it was called, right, during the end of the 13th, early 14th century, regularly employed tens of thousands of pikemen. Henry VII of Luxembourg, when he comes in the Po Valley to be crowned emperor eventually in Rome, the first thing he does, and he was a fully French, militarily speaking, in terms of military culture, the first thing he does, he recruits in the Po Valley tens, or at least he issues the recruitment of tens of thousands of pikemen. So this reveals that also the top feudal authorities in Europe were absolutely aware and fine with the employment of these means in a way, right? But when you have tens of thousands of pikemen that move, that advance, that are coordinated with cavalry, you see there that there is a huge military resource investment, right? Nobody basically had this offensive capability fully regularized, fully standardized as the Swiss in the mid-15th century, because essentially of political cohesion, right? They managed to invest, to provide so much resources to create a military system, because it's professional, right? This is a bit like the history of, as you know, the Swiss model would eventually take over, as would be imitated by everybody, by the French, by the Germans, with the Landsknechten. But if you look at the history of early modern Europe, right, what you see essentially is the history of countries that were all basically medieval in kind of recruitment type, just with mercenary companies. At a certain point, become wealthy enough to centralize and to provide money for at least an initial nucleus of permanent military forces that are such, because they're full professionals, that make the difference eventually with other stuff, right? And the country that goes full professional for the first time is naturally the France of Louis XIV. And all the other countries eventually evolved, and basically we still live in that wake. I mean, we have a fully professional military in a way or another, right? Yes, there are kind of there are also certain communities that participate in some different ways, but fundamentally that's our deal, because we have enough money to provide a standard professional training to people by, you know, training them in large numbers and keep them in large numbers and making them do stuff that provide that level of order and discipline, etc. That in the Middle Ages most powers didn't have, because they didn't have enough resources to impose it on people. That's the radical difference between, I don't know, a Swiss army at Morgarten. It's just literally commoners that are not are not military professionals, and a mid-15th century Swiss pike block of thousands of men that marches properly drilled with drums, etc., that can advance, attack, right? Infantry before that point was basically only defensive. Like, they could advance in the 14th century up to the enemy, but then they stopped to receive the assault, right? And sometimes they could actually close with their wings. When they were stationed on the wings, they could fall on the enemy from the flanks. When the enemy wings had taken out, this is mostly exemplified in Italian warfare, was regularly employed, but even in there we don't understand whether this maneuver was actually carried out with order or it was just mass enclosing on, eventually just having the infantry wings collapse. It was just the cavalry fighting in the middle against the other cavalry and attacked by enemy infantry at that point on the flanks, right? And at that point it's just, you know, a matter of time. Doesn't even matter whether the infantry is actually drilled and in order and in line. It's just about that the cavalry is overwhelmed because it's attacked from all sides. And in this regard, what is fascinating is that we have completely lacked a little bit in historiography this kind of quantities and dimensions in medieval warfare. I made a video just recently about this. That is to say, have we gotten medieval warfare right? Right? Instead of studying individual countries and just focusing on them, have we studied complexively how this worked? Because, for example, the tactic of infantry on the flanks is something that you don't quite find before a certain point onwards. The first time, 1289 Italy, there were certain authors that, for example, suggested it for that would become standard, for example, for English armies since 1332, right? And will always be like that. but that was already around. The English, the same English already knew this stuff, right? Some of the, I don't know, Castruccio, for example, the Lucan military commander, he was a favorite of Edward II. Edward I, actually, excuse me, even better. So he lived at the court of England, and he was able, he fought in the same Flanders during the Flemish rebellion against the French, together with the, Italian infantry mercenaries, pikemen, that Philip IV of France had hired after the defeat of Courtrai to fight the Flemish. Right, and Chronicle says that the Flemish were actually quite impressed by that tactic as well. So there was something in the air, but studies that have covered this satisfactorily, also because sources are probably not really that are not present. But hey, there we have a European scale military culture that is basically being shared around and eventually replicated, right? And there are no actual studies on this, right? Most scholars basically limited themselves, saying, "Oh, look, in this country they didn't even properly realize, they didn't even properly compare the two things. They just limited themselves to say, okay, this place had infantry was more or less developed. They didn't even properly compare the kind of tactics they were using." And that tells you how few we actually study military history in that regard. So going back to the point of urbanization alone is not the deal, right? The Flemish example should be even here play accurately, because even though the Flemish achieved that victory, still we've seen that they are defeated still by essentially French armies, were either French or Burgundian, proper in the following centuries. So urbanization, yes, but with which results? You pick the Ditmarscher, you pick the Swiss, you pick the Frisians, even the Scots. Let's be honest, Scotland is not properly, dramatically urbanized place, to say the least. Where's urbanization there that makes you think? There's literally peasants, right? So this is very important. For example, in the case of Scotland, we have properly a feudal, let's say, a peasant levy proper that makes the bulk of the troops that start playing hard, right, at battles like even at Falkirk, right? Even when they get defeated, but you can see there that the Scots were defeated only after the English had recognized they couldn't charge into their ranks, and they had to use archers to soften up their lines before English cavalry could charge into them, right? So even the idea of weapons being able to stop cavalry is not quite the thing, because you see those were pikemen, but just like at Courtrai, etc., the cavalry was normally habituated to charge into the ranks of pikesmen, right? They would naturally wait a long time. Look at Bannockburn, the English cavalry that turns around all the Scottish circles to spot the line of the weakest spot of the line, and internally behind the pikemen, all the Scottish infantry that toured around, following the English around the perimeter to provide the bulk. Because the problem is not the tactical formula. The problem is how strongly you resist. That's the important thing. So at Courtrai as well, the French managed literally to break through the Flemish phalanx. And they're stopped just because they have attempted a reserve that normally they didn't use, right? Also, this infantry normally sucks. Why do the Flemish mostly lose at that point? Because they're good at resisting against a cavalry charge, especially well placed behind a ditch, etc., as it was regular for infantry since the previous centuries. But then they don't have cavalry on their own, so when they defeat the enemy cavalry, they kind of break the ranks and pursue them, and cavalry often regroups and is able to actually attack them and destroy them, right? And that's a weakness, right? And then you would say, is an only infantry army actually useful? In many ways, right? Especially with an infantry that at this point still can't properly advance without losing cohesion, because it's not trained, it's not drilled enough, like only from the mid-15th century the Swiss will be able to achieve. Evidently not. So it would be actually silly to have cavalry not to use it. So, and that still maintains its own importance. So urbanization, yes and no, meaning that unless you consider the city as a particular form of political cohesion, that is fundamentally the single most important factor here, right? Um, that is what makes it think. This idea, this sense of cohesion that could stem from different reasons, from rising national identities, like, and there was obviously made by economical interests, need of independence, all these reasons that naturally make people wanting to fight all together with a common effort against someone else. This is what makes the difference in warfare, right? So urbanization, yes and no, right? Because urbanization can also turn into, like, eventually the Italian city-states became, where the infantry fights, where the communities fight so much that the middle classes are worn out, and the lords, the seigniories, take over eventually, and they basically just hire mercenaries that are mostly cavalry, right? Because lots of infantrymen are more, very costly, and in order to be effective in the right number on the field, and that it can also become revolutionary in a sense, right? That's the fear, that eventually the Italians will pay for in the Italian wars, because they hadn't properly had the interest to develop a professional military class on a citizen base on their own, right? But even in there, we know that was the future, but it would be the future like 300 years later with the French Revolution, the nation state, and mass levies, right? By the 16th century, still, it was, the means that were used were fundamentally not bad. What in that case happened is that Italy was all fragmented, and France was a unitary country, and therefore, literally there was no local cohesion, so nobody cared about their neighbors, right? As they took them out, well, who cares? Maybe they even participated. So once again, it's political cohesion that makes eventually the victory as such. That's why the English achieve so much, because the English basically decide from one day to another, maybe not literally, but in the sense that they decide that at some point they have to fight in that mode of dismounted men-at-arms with longbowmen on the flanks, and they increase, they start specializing in that sense, because there is a monarch that properly decides that, right? Edward I, Edward II go toward that direction. Edward III, the greatest military genius in English history, fulfills that development, and that system will strike victories, astonishing victories throughout all the 100 Years' War, and because they had, and that was an elite that made it work, right? It wasn't the English commoners that made the infantry strength. No, there was a monarchy that paid money, because it was as a freaking unitary monarchy that worked well, of ancient unity, of effective administration, that decided to maintain essentially an aristocratic army, because the men-at-arms were, even if they were hired like mercenaries, fundamentally noblemen, and lots of longbowmen that were by themselves they would always be sent in France making mess. So the English naturally vented a lot of the possible, veterans instances by repaying these guys simply by looting in France and not causing turmoil in England. But still, longbowmen were useless, right? You don't have an army of longbowmen that wins. They can't. Without men-at-arms, you go nowhere, so much that when the English lose the 100 Years' War, it's the nobility naturally that engulfs the whole country with the Wars of the Roses. They basically just kill each other because they're the most important military political elements, and there is no thing like in England the creation of a middle class infantry that actually is able to achieve anything consistently from the field. So in this sense, you should also never, in this broader picture, before the mid-15th century, you actually don't have a real professional infantry tout court, right? The closest thing we see here is naturally what happens a bit in Italy up to the mid-14th century, what happens with the longbowmen in Britain, in English armies, but still missile troops do not stand their ground. They're light infantry with the proper definition of light infantry. That is, it can't stand the ground against the heavy one, and therefore they are kind of also, I noticed from a political point of view, right? You can have tons of them, but alone they won't win a battle. If cavalry arrives, they're done for, right? So you need on the field to have men-at-arms from their side, like the English themselves have against the French in France. But still, without men-at-arms, you go nowhere. Longbowmen alone do not win a good anything. And the same is valid all over Europe. There is no army of missile troopers, because guess what? They're not enough, right? And that's why the principle of combined arms and a more composite interaction between arms starts actually changing the thing. So if we look at a military, let's say, revolution, which I dislike as a term, as you understood, it's more about the realization of the need of an increased professional element in the army that starts happening, in fact, literally from the mid-14th century, even just in terms of things like permanence, needing troops that you have to rely constantly, not just the old feudal levy that basically doesn't exist anymore in practice. And that will lead very gradually in the following century to the emergence of some professional corps of troops, right? But even in there it was somewhat accidental, right? What if the Swiss in the mid-15th century hadn't made that reform? That was also incidental in a way. By that time, the best armies in Europe were the Burgundian army of Charles the Bald, that is incidentally the one defeated by the same Swiss, the Venetian Condotta, I would say, at least especially from an organizational point of view. They were essentially medieval armies in the sense that they were still based on this combination of arms where one was not prevalent. The Swiss introduced this massive infantry, professionally drilled, and makes a difference. Why they did that? Literally, because at some point they get defeated in 1422 at the Battle of Arbedo, where the Condotta of the Count of Carmagnola basically dismounts, right, and the knights with their lances manage to outperform the Swiss halberdiers that were the prevalent trooper. There were pikemen, but they weren't all pikemen, as we've seen. Still, these armies were fundamentally non-professionally drilled. They were a bit clumsy, right? So these dismounted knights managed to defeat Swiss infantry, right? And that tells you how much the mounted elite was capable, right? Also dismounted to get rid of what was Swiss infantry was a good infantry, right? So after that defeat, the bloody defeat, the Swiss in their mountains, away from indiscreet eyes, decide to begin to drill every trooper with a pike, right? And to do it with an enormous expense that of course will bring them also to, let's say, the Swiss were not just on the defense, right? In the Burgundian wars they also properly passed on the strategic offensive sometimes. So there was a political vision there that was making them confident about what they were doing. They had a joint political unity of command. Politically speaking, is fundamental and is reflected definitely from a military point of view, right? We made videos also on the Burgundian army. We'll come back doing them at some point again. But just for saying how, if that defeat had not happened, maybe the Swiss would have not been the first to develop that model. You need a political reason. You need in that sense, also a military reason, a social one. So it's not so mechanical for which you say, okay, what is that actually makes it? It's really a combination of factors. Surely, another factor that we didn't point out is wealth, right? What happens overall in this picture is that infantries rise again in Europe because politically and socially and militarily, because also the middle classes in certain areas, in parallel to the development of feudalism, that is outside of feudalism very often, but sometimes also within the same, become richer, right? Why were these guys so eager to defend their independence? Because they had a lot of money, right? Why did the Lombards oppose the Hohenstaufen? Because they had freaking cities, merchant interests, that they had political bodies, that they had freaking states that they had to preserve. They didn't want to give them up. Why did the Flemish withstand the French? Because they were invaded, and the French wanted to strip them of their economical resources. They were making big with textile production and all this stuff. The same goes for the Scots. You freaking invade me. I resist. So wealth is important, but it's not all, as we've seen. Right? The Flemish and the Italians are rich. The Ditmarscher, the Scots are not, individually as single infantrymen. Right? And this is reflected also, in fact, in the, let's say, the equipment here is also more or less, by the 14th century, especially Europeans all fight in the same way. That is, the equipments are the same. It's just the amount, the available amount of protection that is not. Right? So we can imagine, I don't know, a Scottish army less rich in armor than an Italian one, for example. The same goes, the Flemish one surely much better equipped than a Frisian one, and they're just next door almost, right? But they're very different societies also because of wealth, right? So that is not also the entire story by itself, right? So I would say these are the main factors. Some say geographical factors because the Swiss were within the mountains. Well, that helped a bit because they were helped both strategically and tactically by terrain, right? And that probably also, decreases a little bit their actual infantry quality factor in perspective, because an ambush is different from a pitched battle, right? But still, the political and social factors are definitely overwhelming there, right? You can't isolate, you can't take them out and say, okay, well, just it was the ground, the terrain. No, not really, right? It was, once again, as we've seen, the political fragmentation in the German kingdom, the fact that these communities had individually enriched themselves. For example, why did they become rich? Because they were on a frontier, which is different from saying, okay, I am a Flemish merchant that is framed within an international market, makes a lot of money because I actually produce goods. The Swiss didn't do much of that, right? They were shepherds. They were a poorer, wilder society, but still they made money because they exacted them from with the tolls from the exacted tolls from the mountain passes. In fact, and that is another thing that must be taken into consideration. There were also there was things like luck, banally speaking. If they had lost individually one of these first battles, they would have been crushed by the Habsburgs and we wouldn't be talking about them. So there is nothing actually deterministic about that, right? We just have a set of factors that surely are similar among each other, but they're combined in a unique way in each reality. And some of them are overlooked. In some regions where infantry victories didn't happen are also overlooked, just because infantry victory didn't happen. It's our own modern obsession. We are searching for infantry victories because for today it's a prelude to modernity. For them it wasn't like that. For them it was something, and it isn't like that properly from an historical point of view. So it's very difficult for the first half of the 14th century to actually talk about that. Briefly, we can say something a little bit more about the before and the after to complete the picture. During the 12th, 13th century, infantry is, as we've seen, kept growing, even though they were subdued by the cavalry, the knightly elite. But this, by the 12th, 13th century, we're not dramatically informed about battle tactics. And we are also reading mostly accounts of people that weren't quite acquainted with that military reality. When we read battle accounts from, we can't simply stereotypically say from clergymen, etc. Sometimes it's literally the military class that could write, and doing it in a poetic way, or even in a stylized way. I mean, there were literally fighters that wrote about battles and that didn't write anything about actual combat. right? Because it was a way, there was a canon there. There was something different to the actual. It was a different historiography, right? As a consequence, we are told a lot of stories that are not quite true, such as the fact that, for example, the chivalry. Chivalry didn't quite exist, right? There was a common sense of the idea of fairness, loyalty, etc. But the idea that, I don't know, that the crossbow was immoral. I personally doubt that, aside from certain circles, people believed that the crossbow was actually immoral, right? There was a good reason not to arm. The middle classes could become dangerous against the elite. But if the elite had to win a war, of course they would use crossbows. I mean, every knight knew how to use one as well as a bow throughout all of medieval warfare. So when we actually have a little bit of insight what the concrete thing could be like, we see that morals, that ethics was very relative to reality of warfare. But not just banally because we say that war is hell or more, whatever. No, we're talking about the actual competence, military, military of command, of military experience. Normally, you would use everything, and we do. And what in those early centuries we're mostly prevented from seeing is the actual interaction between cavalry and infantry that very often was very close, was very intense, and always was historically from even previous times and later ones, right? So this opposition between cavalry and infantry is very functional for many people who want to focus just on tactics, but it doesn't take into consideration the political and social reality, which was that you would normally use cavalry and infantry together. And then the relation between these two elements that surely were in conflict with each other for political reasons, class reasons, whatever, still didn't erase a practice of warfare was standardly about cavalry and infantry, right? And the interesting thing is that in later times, where the squares of thousands of professional pikemen come into use, the greatest difference with the 14th century exploit of infantry is that this new infantry now is under the power of monarchs, of princes, of the highest nobility. These are not freemen anymore. These are just mercenaries that are paid, as any soldier, to fight for a monarchic power that was not contested anymore, right? Literally, there is an increase in power, in absolutism throughout the early modern age, and the fact that infantry acquired a greater importance during the Renaissance doesn't actually mean at all that people were, let's say, politically freer, right? A medieval peasant in that regard would be freer in proportion, right, than these subjects here. The example of Switzerland in mid-15th century is a bit of an exception because Switzerland, yes, is free at that point and fights for its freedom, but basically after Marignano, it gets defeated. Its military system is surpassed by the Spanish one, and Switzerland remains, yes, a very prosperous nation, but let's say peripheral to eventually European political and military events. Whereas the infantries are developed dramatically in the kingdoms par excellences, Spain, France, eventually every power that could afford that lots of infantrymen armed, drilled professionally, but that still having enough power to keep them under the control of the crown, because they wouldn't form a revolutionary class that could create problems, right? And part of this happens because still the numbers of these troops are contained, like they're not literally mass levies of all the troops. The Swiss made a tremendous effort because they were very entrepreneurially minded. In the mid-15th century, they realized they could mobilize this enormous amount of troops because they had a lot to gain from the way they would employ their own military instruments and achieve stuff, right? But if you look at the average, so they're a bit an exception, but the average modern warfare, you always see sovereigns that are chronically out of money and that they can't just raise these professionally drilled armies, but every once in a while, for a certain time, in just some places, there is a lot of still of volunteers, a lot of subcontracts and all this stuff, because it costed too much, right? So before you have an actual state worth of this name with Louis XIV France, you can't quite have the same, like a full professional standard of a, of a permanent army as we mean it in a modern sense, and this is really the key through which this thing has to be read, right? What is the infantry revolution at the end of the day? You see, in the early modern age, infantry was more important than it was in the late modern age, for example, compared to cavalry and to artillery, right? So it's interesting because by the late modern age, the middle classes started acquiring more power. So it's not dichotomic, it's not directly proportional. It's a double thread thing, or a multiple thread, even more. And there is not a monofactual explanation in that regard, and especially there is not a linear trend of infantry effectiveness, right? And what actually makes the modernity, what really changes warfare, is the increased interaction between arms and their individual, the combination of their power individually, right? Cavalry becomes heavier, and also, yes, it's the one that suffers the most from this, but infantry also becomes bulkier, more resilient. Artillery becomes more, firearms in general become more powerful. So it's at that point you can't do without them, right? After the Black Death, Europe is not the same anymore. You can't compare Swiss army of the 15th century with one of the 14th century. They're fundamentally different. It lacks comparison because tactical factors and variables are also altered. The increase of firearms by the 70s, the 80s of the 14th century starts becoming something you can't deny anymore. By the 20s of the 15th century, artillery becomes now kind of a must, an updated, a must for every military updated prince in Europe. By the 16th century, you can't literally do without. So there is in this, therefore, always a matter of that. This is always the question: who did use these armies and why, and who did participate to these armies and why, right? And that is the key of the answer. Scots, Flemish, Frisians, Dithmarschen, Swiss, Italians, they're all different, and they all have a different political and social background at that point that doesn't quite tell you where infantry was stronger or weaker, just because, I don't know, there was a single factor that you can measure the thing through, right? All factors are important, but individually they don't make the thing. It's the sum of them, and very often we don't understand how it happened, especially from a moral point of view. We don't know when infantry began to literally acquire the awareness that they could make it against cavalry again, right? Probably they kind of always knew that, but they simply accepted that it was not because they couldn't make it just on the field. It's that they didn't have any valid reason for making it in politics and society in the first place, right? And naturally, this is there are thought-provoking ideas in general, such as the fact that fringe areas were, let's say, relying on infantry, even against and sometimes successful against the finest of cavalry, right? Look at, I don't know, Welsh or Irish infantries. They weren't bad for most low Middle Ages, let's say, in their own environment, even against, I don't know, English heavy cavalry. Why? Well, part of the reason also because it's not a mechanical matter. It's because literally the interest of England to get involved dramatically in those areas was altogether less than even, I don't know, just compared to Scotland or to France, where most wealth was and where most of their attention was directed. So the same goes for, I don't know, look at Germany. Germany, before Frederick I Barbarossa, didn't quite have a real feudalism. It was a bit like Scotland, right? Where feudalism was truly important in the 12th century. And you find in Germany it was more infantry. Why? In part because the elites were poorer, in part because the ground was tougher, in part because literally, in fact, not existing a properly feudal society, they couldn't produce also more than much, right? But also who would quite have an interest to expand in Germany, where there were richer areas around, and this is a bit like a standard, right? And the fact that professional infantry eventually was developed not because there were more freer communities, but on the contrary, because there was an ever greater monarchy that could impose that on the same communities, is proven by the fact that in early modern Europe, the most underdeveloped areas in Europe still use cavalry, like in the Middle Ages, the more east you go, for example, and also for other reasons, not just so, but still, right? Whereas infantry is Western Europe. And all the Eastern European sovereigns take military advisors, engineers, etc. from the West because they want to copy the thing and to create a system that allows to paradoxically oppress, but through the same infantry. So it's not just about to oppress. I use it in neutral term. I mean, to oppress in the sense to actually keep an order. I actually attribute a positive value of civilization of discipline and pacification, even forcefully imposed, because without that you can't really have an orderly, prosperous growth. But literally that was done at that point through pike and shot, and those weren't noblemen, right? Let's leave aside the Spanish territory that was theoretically made up of also large amounts of noblemen, but because just 1/3 of Spanish male adults were noblemen, namely, right? It was just a gentry fundamental. But it's important because you see there that there is really no linear trend. It's all intertwined with other phenomena that happened step by step and that didn't quite happen because of a single factor, right? So I would say that fundamentally, and I made videos about most of the stuff I just discussed, actually. So here and there, most people don't know I have playlists, lots of, not just I made lots of videos, but there are lots of playlists. You can search them through, and if you go medieval warfare, and there are also single countries themed playlists, etc. So or infantry, there is an infantry warfare playlist or cavalry warfare playlist. So if you want to concentrate on those arms, we have that stuff too. So yeah, this is pretty much my answer. I hope it satisfies the question, because I realize that this topic is very, it's, in my opinion, given that I've been close to it for a long time, I think it's been dramatically overlooked, right? That it's literally historiography's fault for having literally given a misregulated picture of the actual perspectives and dynamics of this period in history, because the 14th century, where most of this stuff happens, is objectively a very complicated century. It's probably the most messed up in absolute terms, and I hated it at the beginning. I ended up to make a PhD on it, but when you look into it, you take the patience to actually try to understand, everything is much more orderly than it seems, and it's great because it was a century of great change, but in a positive sense, in a way, even in the crisis, and or exactly because of the crisis, because of the increased need to put an end, literally, to things like, even people were tired of fighting. If you wonder even why infantry stopped, because at some point it was too much, right? I prefer to have a lord to keep doing what I do than, let's say, having to fight every time for my right. He will take care of that as long as we are a community, a unitary community. There is enough identification with that. We can't do it, right? But it's complicated. It's really complicated. So I hope to talk more about the 14th century also, because we didn't do it pretty much. All right. So for now, I'll stop it here. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.